How does a city, a fortress really, that's almost impossible to break into, just fall? Well, this isn't a story about a brilliant conquering army. It's the story of how an enemy, festering inside its own walls, brought a great city to its knees. It's a classic tragedy, not of conquest, but of pure self-destruction.
So let's just start with that question. Put yourself in the shoes of a general. You're staring up at these massive, impenetrable walls. You've got a huge army, sure, but a head-on attack? That would be a slaughter. So, how do you take a city like that?
The answer is, you don't. You just wait. You wait for it to tear itself apart from the inside out. And yeah, that is exactly what happened to Jerusalem. Its fall was a self-inflicted wound, and it was bleeding out long before the Romans ever even touched the gates.
So, where did it all go so wrong? How does this kind of self-destruction even start? Well, the first cracks started to show when the city's very identity came under attack from its own people.
Okay, so picture this. The Roman army is just tearing through the north, and thousands of refugees start pouring into Jerusalem for safety. But here's the thing. Among them were these radical revolutionaries, the Zealots. And they weren't coming for shelter. Oh no. They came looking for a fight, and they lit a political firestorm that immediately put them at odds with the city's leadership.
And right away, you've got these two sides squaring off. On one side, you have the city's establishment, led by the high priest Ananus. You can think of them as the pragmatists. And on the other side, you've got the zealot rebels, these firebrands like John of Gischala, who believed any kind of compromise was basically treason. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some political squabble, this was a fight for the very soul of the city.
Look, a city can handle some political drama. It can survive tension. But what happens when one side decides to, well, eliminate the other through lies and violence? That, right there, that's the point of no return.
And this is where it gets really ugly. You can see how one calculated lie just spirals into a full-blown massacre. The zealot leader, John of Gischala, he just makes something up. He claims the high priest Ananus is secretly planning to hand the city over to the Romans. Based on that total fabrication, the zealots send out a desperate plea for help to a neighboring army, and it works. 20,000 soldiers show up, and in the chaos that follows, they help the zealots hunt down and murder Ananus and his entire party.
And the real tragedy here? It's who they killed. Annas was seen as the one guy who could actually keep the city safe. He was the last real voice of reason. With his murder, the city didn't just lose a leader, it lost its conscience. The brakes were off, and the path to ruin was now wide open.
But did the zealots' victory bring everyone together? Of course not. What do you think happened? Instead, all that lust for power just shattered the city's defense into this chaotic, three-way civil war.
This power struggle just evolved into total madness. The city became this patchwork of warring little kingdoms. You had John of Gischala holding the outer temple courts. Then his rival, Eleazar, he splits off and takes the inner temple, which was higher ground. And then a third warlord, Simon Bar Giora, a brutal guy they actually invited in to fight John, he just decides to take the rest of the city for himself.
So get this. This is the absolutely crucial part. While the Roman legions are literally gathering outside the walls, setting up for a siege, Jerusalem's defenders are locked in a bloody civil war inside the walls. They were more focused on killing each other than on the actual enemy. Every single resource, every soldier, every ounce of energy was just poured into this internal power struggle. It's insane.
And this infighting, it leads to what might just be the single most catastrophic act of self-sabotage in military history. I mean, an act that absolutely guaranteed the city would starve to death.
Now think about this for a second. The city was smart. They were prepared. They had stockpiled enough food, enough grain to survive a Roman siege for years. Not months, years. They had everything they needed to outlast the enemy.
And what do they do with it? They burned it. On purpose. In their constant attacks on each other, John's faction would burn Simon's grain stores. So Simon's men would retaliate and burn John's. It was a conscious, strategic decision made by both sides to destroy the city's ability to feed itself, all for a tiny advantage in their own petty war.
So that horrific famine that came next, that wasn't a Roman tactic. That wasn't some unfortunate consequence of the siege. It was a crisis manufactured and delivered by Jerusalem's own defenders. They literally created their own doom.
You have to understand, long before the Romans ever broke through the walls, the people of Jerusalem were already living through a siege. It just wasn't a siege from the outside. It was a siege of terror from within.
For the average citizen, daily life was a living hell. Zealot factions would just burst into homes, torturing people to confess where they'd hidden a scrap of bread. The famine got so bad people were gnawing on the leather from their own shields, and you couldn't escape. Anyone caught trying to flee was just executed as a traitor. They even outlawed burying the dead, just leaving bodies to rot in the streets.
And this created the ultimate trap. There was simply no way out. If you tried to flee one tyrant's territory, you just run straight into another's. The people were caught in the crossfire between these warring factions, with starvation inside the walls and certain death if they tried to get out.
And all this brings us to a final thought from the philosopher Seneca. In the end, the Romans didn't really conquer Jerusalem. They basically just arrived to claim a city that had already committed suicide. This whole story is just a timeless, brutal lesson. The greatest threat you face often isn't the enemy at the gates, it's the division within.